March 1, 1991. The war has been over for less than 24 hours. Red Adair, the legendary oil well firefighter from Texas, is flying into Kuwait for the first time. Looking out the window of his helicopter, he sees something he's never seen before in 40 years of fighting oil fires. The horizon is black, not dark black. 700 oil wells are burning, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, smoke so thick it's blocking out the sun. Lakes of crude oil spreading across the desert. Red Adair turns to his team and says, "Boys, this is going to be the biggest job of our lives." Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about one of Saddam Hussein's final acts of spite, setting Kuwait's oil fields on fire. As Iraqi forces retreated in late February 1991, they systematically destroyed over 700 oil wells. The fires burned for months. The environmental damage was catastrophic. The economic cost was in the billions, and the images of a black sky at noon became one of the most iconic and disturbing legacies of Desert Storm. This is the story of Kuwait's oil fires and the incredible effort to extinguish them. Let's start with why Saddam did this. By late February, it was clear Iraq was losing the war. Iraqi forces were being destroyed in Kuwait and southern Iraq. The retreat had turned into a rout. Saddam ordered his troops to destroy everything they couldn't take with them, a scorched earth policy, blow up buildings, destroy infrastructure, and set the oil wells on fire. If Iraq couldn't have Kuwait's oil wealth, nobody would. Iraqi combat engineers had been preparing for this for weeks. They'd rigged wellheads with explosives. They'd placed charges to rupture pipelines. When the order came to withdraw, they executed the demolitions. Well after well erupted in flames. Some burned immediately. Others gushed crude oil that pooled on the desert surface before igniting. By the time coalition forces liberated Kuwait, over 600 wells were burning. Another 100 were damaged and gushing oil but not burning yet. The scale was unprecedented. Kuwait had over 1,000 oil wells before the war. More than 70% were now destroyed or damaged. At peak production before the invasion, Kuwait produced about 2 million barrels of oil per day. Now, millions of barrels were burning every single day. The economic loss was staggering, but more immediately terrifying was the environmental catastrophe unfolding in real time. Captain Mike Davis was a combat engineer with the 1st Infantry Division. His unit was among the first coalition forces to reach the oil fields. He described the scene as apocalyptic. It was noon, but it looked like twilight. The smoke was so thick the sun was just a dim orange circle. Oil was raining down on us, literal black rain from the smoke condensing. The noise from hundreds of burning wells was like standing next to jet engines. And the heat, you could feel it from hundreds of meters away. The immediate health effects were obvious. Soldiers and civilians in Kuwait were breathing air filled with toxic smoke. Soot covered everything. People were coughing, having respiratory problems, experiencing headaches and nausea. Medical units saw a spike in respiratory complaints. Doctors worried about long-term health impacts from extended exposure to burning crude oil smoke. Nobody knew what months of breathing this air would do to people. The smoke plumes were visible from space. Satellite images showed massive black clouds stretching hundreds of miles. The smoke reached altitudes of 20,000 feet. It spread across the Persian Gulf, affecting Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. There were predictions, later proven wrong, that the smoke could affect global climate. Some scientists worried the smoke could trigger cooling effects similar to a nuclear winter. That didn't happen, but the fear was real at the time. Environmental groups were horrified. Greenpeace and other organizations called it one of the worst environmental disasters in history. And they weren't wrong. The amount of pollutants being released daily was staggering. Particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, all carcinogenic, all being pumped into the atmosphere in quantities never seen before. One estimate suggested the fires were releasing more pollution daily than all the cars in the United States combined. But the fires themselves were just part of the problem. Damaged wells that weren't burning were gushing crude oil onto the desert surface. Oil pooled in low-lying areas, creating lakes of crude that covered hundreds of square miles. Some of these oil lakes were several feet deep. They killed wildlife, contaminated groundwater, and created toxic environments that would take years to remediate. Camels, birds, desert foxes, anything that came into contact with the oil died. The oil also flowed into the Persian Gulf. Millions of barrels of crude contaminated coastal waters. Saudi Arabia's desalination plants, critical for providing drinking water, had to shut down intake valves because they were drawing in oil instead of seawater. The marine ecosystem suffered tremendous damage. Fish kills, destroyed coral reefs, contaminated beaches. The Gulf War environmental damage extended far beyond Kuwait's borders. Kuwait's government in exile, now returned to Kuwait City, faced an overwhelming crisis. Their country was liberated, but their economy was destroyed. Oil revenue was Kuwait's lifeblood, and it was literally burning. They needed to extinguish the fires as quickly as possible, but this wasn't a normal firefighting job. These weren't building fires or even normal oil well fires. This was industrial-scale destruction requiring specialized expertise that very few people in the world possessed. Enter the oil well firefighters. Companies like Boots & Coots, Safety Boss, Wild Well Control, and of course, Red Adair Company. These were legendary in the oil industry. They specialized in fighting oil well fires and capping blown-out wells. Their most famous work had been single wells, a blowout here, a fire there. Now they were facing 700 burning wells simultaneously. It was going to require every oil well firefighting team in the world working together for months. Red Adair was 75 years old when he arrived in Kuwait. He'd been fighting oil fires since 1945. He'd fought wells in Algeria, the North Sea, Venezuela, everywhere oil was produced, but he'd never seen anything like this. His team, along with dozens of other firefighting crews from around the world, began assessing the damage. Each well had to be evaluated individually. Some were relatively simple to extinguish. Others would require months of work. The basic technique for fighting an oil well fire hadn't changed much in decades. You need to cut off the fuel supply and smother the flames. That sounds simple. It's not. The wells were under enormous pressure, shooting flames and crude hundreds of feet into the air. The heat was intense enough to melt steel. Firefighters had to approach the wellhead, often while being sprayed with burning oil, and somehow cap it or divert the flow. Different teams used different techniques. Some used water cannons to create a protective curtain of water, then moved in with specialized equipment to cap the well. Others used explosives. They'd position a charge next to the burning well, detonate it, and the explosion would consume all the oxygen, snuffing out the fire. Then they'd rush in and install a cap before the well reignited. It was dangerous, skilled work that required nerves of steel. Joe Bowden was a firefighter with Safety Boss, a Canadian company. He described fighting one well that had created a crater 50 feet deep from the force of the eruption. We had to fill the crater with mud and water while the well was still burning, then use that as a platform to get close enough to cap it. We were working in 150-degree heat, covered in oil, with flames everywhere. One mistake and we'd be incinerated, but we did it. 3 weeks of work, and we finally got that one well capped. The international response was impressive. Firefighting teams came from the United States, Canada, Hungary, Iran, China, Romania, anywhere there was expertise in dealing with oil well fires. Equipment was flown in from around the world. The Kuwaiti government was paying premium rates, up to $1 million per well in some cases. Money was no object. They needed the fires out as fast as possible. The work was incredibly dangerous. Despite all the safety precautions, accidents happened. In April 1991, a massive explosion at one well site killed several workers when accumulated gas ignited. Other workers suffered severe burns. Some died from equipment failures or accidents. The firefighters knew the risks but kept working because the job had to be done. These guys became heroes in Kuwait, celebrated for risking their lives to save the country's economy. Early estimates predicted the fires would burn for years, possibly 5 years or more to extinguish them all. But the firefighting teams were more efficient than expected. They developed new techniques, adapted existing methods, and worked around the clock. By June 1991, just 3 months after liberation, over half the fires were extinguished. The pace accelerated. Teams that had needed weeks for their first well were now capping wells in days. Technology helped. Specialized equipment was developed specifically for the Kuwait fires. Massive water pumps to create protective barriers. Heat-resistant suits that allowed workers to get closer to the flames. Improved well capping equipment. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided support, including dealing with unexploded ordnance. The oil fields were contaminated with mines and unexploded munitions from the war, which had to be cleared before firefighters could work safely. The last oil well fire was extinguished on November 6, 1991, 9 months after liberation. The final well was capped in a ceremony attended by Kuwaiti officials and firefighting team leaders from around the world. Red Adair was there, 86 years old, having worked Kuwait's fires for 8 months. What had been predicted to take 5 years had taken 8 months. It was an incredible achievement by the international firefighting community. But extinguishing the fires was only the beginning of the cleanup. The oil lakes remained. The soot covering everything needed to be removed. The contaminated soil had to be dealt with. The damaged infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Kuwait Oil Company estimated it would take years and billions of dollars to restore production to pre-invasion levels. They were right. Full production wasn't restored until the mid-1990s. The environmental remediation was equally challenging. How do you clean up hundreds of square miles of oil-contaminated desert? The answer involved a combination of techniques. Some oil was pumped out of the lakes and recovered. It was still valuable crude despite being contaminated with sand and debris. Contaminated soil was excavated and either treated or contained. Bioremediation, using bacteria to break down oil, was tested with limited success. The health impacts on people who'd breathed the smoke for months became a concern. Studies were conducted on Kuwaiti civilians and coalition troops who'd been exposed to the oil fire smoke. Results were mixed. Some studies showed increased rates of respiratory problems. Others found no clear long-term effects. Veterans who'd served in Kuwait during the fires sometimes attributed later health problems to smoke exposure, though causation was hard to prove definitively. There was also the question of wildlife impact. Desert ecosystems are fragile, and the oil contamination had devastating effects. Birds that landed in oil lakes died. Desert plants were killed by oil saturation. The soil chemistry was altered in ways that would persist for years. Environmental scientists who studied the affected areas found that recovery would be measured in decades, not years. Some particularly contaminated areas might never fully recover to their pre-war state. One unexpected consequence: the soot from the fires settled over Kuwait and neighboring countries, coating buildings, cars, everything. Cleaning this up was a massive undertaking. Buildings had to be pressure washed. Roads had to be cleaned. The fine particulate matter got into air conditioning systems, water supplies everywhere. Kuwait City looked like it had been dusted with black snow. The cleanup employed thousands of workers for years. The economic cost of the fires is hard to calculate precisely. The immediate loss from burning oil, estimated at 6 million barrels per day at peak, was billions of dollars in lost revenue over the months the fires burned. The cost of extinguishing the fires was over $1.5 billion. The cost of rebuilding damaged infrastructure was tens of billions more. Environmental remediation costs billions more. Conservative estimates put the total cost over $50 billion. Some estimates go much higher. Saddam's environmental terrorism, because that's what it was, backfired strategically. He'd hoped destroying the oil fields would prevent coalition forces from quickly restoring Kuwaiti oil production, denying the West access to that oil. But the international response was so robust, and the firefighters so effective, that production was restored far faster than Iraq expected. The main effect was to cement international condemnation of Iraq and strengthen support for continued sanctions. There was also a legal dimension. After the war, the United Nations Compensation Commission was established to handle claims against Iraq for damages from the invasion and occupation. Environmental damage claims were a major category. Kuwait submitted extensive documentation of environmental harm, the oil fires, the oil lakes, the marine pollution, everything. Iraq was held financially responsible, though actually collecting that compensation took years. The oil fires became one of the most photographed aspects of Desert Storm. Images of firefighters silhouetted against massive flames became iconic. Satellite photos of smoke plumes became symbols of environmental destruction. The fires were featured in documentaries, news coverage, and even a Werner Herzog film called Lessons of Darkness that showed the fires in almost abstract, artistic terms. The visual impact was profound and lasting. For the people of Kuwait, the fires were a daily reminder of what Iraq had done to their country. Even after the war ended, even after liberation, they couldn't escape the consequences of occupation. The black sky, the oil-soaked desert, the toxic air, these were Saddam's parting gift. It created a sense of violation and anger that persisted long after the fires were out. Kuwait would never forgive Iraq for the environmental destruction. Environmental lessons from the oil fires influenced international law. The deliberate destruction of oil wells was recognized as environmental warfare, a war crime. Future conflicts would see greater attention to environmental protection. The principle that environmental damage during warfare could have legal consequences was strengthened. Not that this prevented environmental damage in later conflicts, but at least there was greater international consensus that it was wrong. The firefighters who worked in Kuwait became legends in their industry. Red Adair's final major job before retirement was Kuwait, a fitting end to an incredible career. Many younger firefighters who worked Kuwait went on to work oil fires around the world, trained by the experience they'd gained. The techniques developed or refined in Kuwait became standard practice. The Kuwait fires became a case study in how to manage large-scale industrial disasters. Today, if you visit Kuwait's oil fields, you can still find remnants of the fires, scorched earth, patches of contaminated soil. The landscape was permanently altered, but the oil fields are productive again. Kuwait's economy recovered. The environmental damage, while severe, wasn't as apocalyptic as some feared. Nature proved more resilient than expected, though full recovery in some areas will take generations. There's a memorial in Kuwait to the firefighters who extinguished the wells. It acknowledges their courage and skill in taking on one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. For months, these men worked in conditions that would terrify most people, surrounded by flames, breathing toxic smoke, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. They did it because it needed to be done, and they did it faster than anyone thought possible.